If you take a look at the Chinese economic model, what you see is a system of state support that is built to dominate and take over entire industries. So this is what I mean by we've seen the pattern. Steel and aluminum, solar panels, batteries, EVs. Today, China's production capacity in steel is 55% of world capacity. That's in one country. Aluminum, 60%. EVs, 60%. Solar, 80%. And in certain critical minerals, 85 to 95%.
The U.S. is panicking over China's control of supply chains as Beijing dominates numerous industries today, including steel, global shipping, electric vehicles, and solar panels. While the G7 countries were inactive, China was busy building out its supply chains and has now cornered multiple markets. In response, the U.S. and its allies have implemented trade tariffs, barriers, and restrictions, which are essentially a collective freakout. A concerning development is that the West is now targeting China's overcapacity in plastic production, framing it as a global issue that needs to be addressed. Cheap plastic exports are seen as harmful to Western economies. This situation is dangerous because the focus has shifted from high-tech goods to low-value products. China producing plastic toys and nylon shirts has become the new boogeyman. We are witnessing a total decoupling of the West from anything Chinese. It's important to remember that companies in the U.S. and the West willingly outsourced low-value manufacturing to Beijing. The strategy was straightforward. Use cheap Chinese labor to produce unglamorous items like plastic bags, allowing the West to climb the value chain. This was the playbook when China entered the World Trade Organization. However, relinquishing an entire industry has consequences. China now produces more petrochemicals than it needs, which are the feedstocks necessary for plastic production. By next year, China's production will surpass its capacity across the board, including in propylene, methanol, and glycol. China will have excess capacity in almost every category, enabling it to support its domestic economy and supply the world with plastics simultaneously. Is that really so bad? China adding more supply to the global economy means prices will come down. There's a reason why the West, especially the US, is sounding the alarm. They are about to lose yet another industry to China. For many years, Chinese companies were net importers of plastics. They produced some, but bought more from places like America. However, since March 2024, China has become a net exporter of key plastic products, challenging a $300 billion industry in the U.S. Regardless of election outcomes, punishments are likely on the horizon, whether in the form of tariffs or quota restrictions. The trade war is set to escalate, which is very dangerous given the world is already grappling with an inflation crisis. From shampoos and diapers to packaging, a vast array of products require petrochemicals, and plastics are definitely involved.
I just, looked through my Walmart history, and I found this, Walmart order from 2 years ago for the whole month worth of groceries. 45 items cost $126. A whole month of groceries just for me, basically. But I did notice this reorder all button, and I wanted to see how much it would cost now. Now, this order of 45 items for 1 month would have cost $414. That is 4 times more.
Just look at your grocery bill. Things are probably 100% more expensive than they were a few years ago. If Chinese plastics flood the market, it will export deflation, and banning them will make inflation worse elsewhere. But the real issue is that the U.S. is afraid of losing market share in its industries. The cost of manufacturing in America is incredibly high. Since January last year, the plastic manufacturing sector has been shedding jobs, with over 10,000 positions lost, and more at risk if China floods the world with exports. The U.S. exports around $70 billion worth of plastic products, so it is very likely that the G7 will impose more trade tariffs on China. The same measures that targeted Chinese EVs will soon hit plastic imports too. It's just a matter of time. But here's a critical question. Why did China's plastic exports suddenly explode over the past 2 years? Who's really at fault here? Over the past 3 years, China has been ramping up its petrochemical capacity, growing by over 9 million tons annually, more than the G7 and the rest of Asia combined. A big question is why this is happening. Subsidies certainly play a part, but so do profit margins. If there's no profit, no company will manufacture products. Here's the kicker. To make petrochemicals, you need oil products like naphtha. China has the world's largest refining capacity, and Russia is their biggest oil supplier. Due to Western sanctions, Moscow has no choice but to divert large quantities of oil to Beijing. With this oversupply, China has the bargaining power to push prices down. China has been buying cheap Russian crude, with discounts reaching an incredible 19% at their peak. Combine this with cheap labor and an abundance of refineries, and China's input costs are much lower. This is a key reason why China is now a net exporter of plastics. Their cost of raw materials and refining is extremely low compared to the West. Thanks to the economic war, China can outproduce low-cost products and export them. Once again, this is the effect of sanctions backfiring. How many times must we go through this? These are the second-order effects starting to manifest. Chinese plastics are coming, but another export causing panic in the West is cheap fertilizers from Russia. A flood of these low-cost Russian exports is entering EU markets, and experts claim this threatens Europe's food security, which seems a bit odd. Farmers across Europe are protesting because of rising costs, high taxes, and restrictive environmental regulations. Cheap Russian fertilizers should be a boon to the industry, benefiting farmers by increasing supply. So, who's really complaining? It's the European fertilizer producers. Take Germany's largest ammonia company, for instance. They argue that Russian exports are cheaper because they pay much less for natural gas compared to EU producers. For almost 2 years now, we've seen that sanctions, especially in the energy sector, have significant consequences. It's not just fuel prices that go up. Other products dependent on oil and gas also become more expensive. To produce fertilizers, you need ammonia, and 70% of ammonia production depends on natural gas, which Russia has in abundance. Russia's cost of production is extremely low, and after the Nord Stream explosion, Germany and most of Europe lost access to cheap Russian gas. As a result, manufacturing ammonia in Europe is no longer competitive. The cause and effect here are straightforward. The EU is exacerbating the problem by importing expensive LNG from Qatar and the US, making it no surprise that their fertilizers can't compete with Russian exports. Amidst a global food crisis, Europe has pledged to help solve it, but their current approach is hindering their ability to compete in the fertilizer market.
And 30% of Ukraine's grain exports are going immediately to low and middle income countries in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Asia. So I think it's very important that we set the record straight. It is Putin who created with his war the food crisis, and it is Europe that is working to end it.
The EU faces a critical choice. To lower food prices and produce more grain, they need Russian fertilizers. If the West decides to ban Russian exports to protect their industries, food prices will skyrocket. Ukrainian or Russian grain alone isn't sufficient. Europe needs affordable fertilizers to grow more food themselves. This will lower costs and enable the EU to export more to countries like Egypt. In the first quarter alone, the EU imported 560,000 tons of Russian fertilizers, nearly matching the total imports for the first 6 months of 2023. By the end of the year, Russian imports could easily exceed 1 million tons, possibly reaching 1.5 million, a new record. This highlights the EU's dependency. Without these imports, prices would soar. While Russian oil and gas imports have decreased, another critical import has risen. The EU has simply swapped one dependency for another. And speaking of panic, let's talk about another G7 country because it seems the hammer is about to fall on Chinese EVs once again. The US has imposed huge tariffs on EVs from China, and now Canada is poised to follow suit. The Canadian government is preparing to curb EV imports, mirroring Biden's move. Consultations have begun, and like the EU, tariffs will likely be next. The finance minister has confirmed that Canada is escalating the trade war with China. On the surface, this sounds bizarre. Canada doesn't have its own car brands. We can understand why the US or the EU wants to impose tariffs. Volkswagen, Mercedes, Ford, Chrysler, and Tesla are all at risk if Chinese vehicles flood the market and eat up market share. But why would Canada do the same? The answer lies in following the money. It was never about climate change. That was just a convenient excuse. Canada's auto industry accounts for 10% of its manufacturing GDP and 21% of trade. Most of this comprises factories producing cars for the US. Many G7 automakers are concentrated in Canada. Ford and General Motors have a presence there, Stellantis from Europe has a factory, and Japan's Honda and Toyota have facilities as well. Canada essentially piggybacked on the US auto industry, which significantly contributed to the Canadian economy's growth, negating the need for domestic car brands. The auto industry supports nearly 600,000 jobs and represents $63 billion in exports, making it Canada's second-largest export industry, just below energy. Given these stakes, the government is under immense pressure. Chinese EVs, being cheaper, could decimate demand for US cars and undermine the Canadian auto industry. We are witnessing North America closing its doors to China, decoupling critical industries, and it's only going to get worse. It's cars today, but it could be plastics tomorrow and perhaps even underwear and toilet paper the day after. However, Canada is flirting with danger. Trade with China has been growing rapidly since 2020, with Beijing accounting for around 10% of Canada's total trade. Retaliations could follow, just like in the EU, with China potentially targeting vulnerable sectors of the Canadian economy. While Canada's auto industry might be protected, it will come at the expense of other industries. The decoupling isn't going to stop. It's only going to intensify.
So, expect a bifurcation in trade. Western markets are increasingly erecting barriers against Chinese goods. As we mentioned earlier, EVs were just the beginning, and now other sectors are also under scrutiny. However, the most impactful move could be against Chinese plastics, which could send inflation soaring. Nothing seems off-limits anymore. And if you think this is a joke, consider this. US golf cart producers are now accusing China of dumping golf carts into America. It's a situation you couldn't make up.
A significant tariff wall is looming over all things Chinese, but the biggest losers will likely be us consumers. Western taxpayers could face even higher prices across the board. Prepare for a bigger trade war ahead. It's bound to get messier and more absurd. The West is actively decoupling from China, and vice versa. As always, let me know your thoughts. Will the G7 target Chinese plastics next? And what might be next on the list? Underwear, socks, or something else from China? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Stay safe and remember to like, subscribe, and follow as we navigate through these turbulent times. Thank you for watching.